I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Welcome back to Hellbent for Horror, and yes, welcome back. It's been a little bit of time for me, and I do want to talk about a little bit of that. First, I want to say happy Halloween to everybody. I hope your 2024 Halloween season has been fantastic so far. I've been having a reasonably good time. It has been a little bit of time since I've done a show, and I didn't expect A Brief History of Failure, which was the last show that I did, to have such ironic meaning for me. I had some technical errors on the last show that I was doing prior to that, and I decided to own up on having this problem and putting out a show that was talking about how failure sometimes works right into the art. And also, sometimes, unfortunately, failure also hinders the art. And I guess, there's something about this podcast medium. I hear people often talk rather personally about themselves, and that's not necessarily how I go. I mean, when I'm doing my show, yes, there's things that I bring out that are personal, but most of the times those things are from the past. They're there to align with what I'm talking about, whatever the message might be, whatever the theme might be for that show. And I'm not afraid to give a little bit of my past, my background. I like to put a little piece of me into the show because I think that it helps you bring a little bit of yourself to the show as well, making it a little bit more like a conversation. But I'm not very good about talking about when things are happening in the real world, as we like to say. There's a difference between S.A. Bradley and Scott Bradley. There's something about S.A. Bradley is kind of a little bit of an emotional removal from the regular world. He's still an emotional guy, but he can keep his cool a little bit better, I think, than Scott Bradley does in the real world. And unfortunately, what's been happening in the last couple of months, people are probably wondering where I've been. And I thought I was going to get things together a little bit easier, but it's just personal issues that are happening, family issues, things that are happening at a certain age. You hit a certain age and people start exiting your life. They start exiting the planet. And there's been a couple things that have happened of recent with unexpected deaths and long-term illnesses for some folks. And it didn't seem to be bothering me that much, but I guess it did. I should have seen that when I was making big mistakes on the podcast, coming back with a head of steam going, we're going to be doing this forever. I've got my mojo back. And then all of a sudden I had a technical issue, which kind of kicked me right in the teeth. That was probably the sign that the balls were not being juggled properly in the air. And so whether, I don't want to go deep into it, but let's just say that there's been some issues in focus. And there's been a difference in some forms of priority. And it's not like I've been completely languishing. I have had a couple short stories that have been put out and published. I've done a few articles and interviews for magazines, and I'll be probably announcing some of those and putting them on the website. I've been terrible about even updating the website. It's very funny how things go. There's probably very few things in the world as important to me as doing this show. Working on the podcast, working in talking to people about horror and going across the country to meet people and to sit on panels and rub elbows with other crazy folks like myself, all of us enjoying the absolute pleasure of being able to champion this wonderful genre of ours. And yet, with that said, there's nothing I love more, and yet it's the thing that gets hurt easily. It's the thing that fell to the wayside. It's the thing that I put in the background for a while. So I want to come back. And I just wanted to let you know where I was, because I have been quiet about it, and that has not necessarily worked out. the way that I thought it would. I thought good old-fashioned stoicism would have gotten me just through. And instead, it just made for silence. So people don't know if this show exists anymore. There's no order to it anymore. There's been no great pattern. I'm going to do my best to get back into a pattern. I'm going to do my best to get this conversation rolling again. And I thank you for being out there. Really, it's just been a joy so far. I want to keep this going as long as I can. I feel the desire to continue to do it. I have at least 1 or 2 episodes that have been sitting there waiting for me to just do some heavy edits on. And I realized I should just do this instead first. I've been a lot better about that recently, and that is mainly because of this creativity, being able to create. So speaking of creating and creativity, I'm going to talk a little bit today about something that I'm putting into the new book. There's a book that's been being written by me for quite a while. Those of you who have read Scream for Pleasure, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy, this is going to be an extension to that, the second nonfiction book. But the name of it is Defenders of the Faith. That's the working title. How Horror is Saving the World One Fan at a Time. And this is something that I was recently writing. And I will say that some of the genius of this, one of the longtime listeners and good friends, John Arminio, we were talking about different things that I might put into the book. And John came up with an idea that was kind of cool. And it was just talking about what we really look for when we're horror fans. You know, if you're a horror fan, and you've been doing it for quite a while, you've seen it all. You haven't seen every movie, but you've seen pretty much the ideas of what cinema tends to use to try and scare us, try and intrigue us into a story. So I wanted to see about taking that idea of something that John Arminio had brought up to me, and I've altered it a little bit, but he came up with a few ideas of dealing with expectations. That what we really look for is someone who can manfully take control and manipulate our expectations, know what our expectations are, and then play with those as much as possible. So what I'm going to talk about here today is going to be an extension of that idea, and I like to call it the 3 doors of death, the ways that you can make horror fans happy. So yes, let's talk about the 3 doors of death, essentially how to surprise fans, horror fans who have seen it all. You know, we horror fans love to say that we want to be scared, but you know, it's very hard to say that you're going to be able to scare us when most of us have been watching horror movies for most of our lives. Some of us amassed thousands and thousands of different movies as part of our list of things that we've seen. So flat out scaring us is kind of a big ask for people. So what I say is, you know, if you can't scare us, surprise us. Because really, we love being scared, but we know that being scared is a rather rare commodity. For the most part, what we really want to find, what we really want to get out of something is an element of surprise, something that just completely takes us out of what our expectations are and rattles us a little bit. Now, I think surprise is a big deal. I think this is where horror and comedy, and I've said this before, and I don't want any of my stand-up comedy friends or comedy writer friends to, you know, kill me while I sleep by saying, oh, horror and comedy are very similar. But I will say that they have certain things that are the same. And one of the things that they have in common is a detriment that they both have, which is the more you study the art of horror and the art of comedy, the more you find yourself anesthetized from surprise. So say you study stand-up comedy most of your life. You're going to learn those primary rhythms. You're going to find the beats that are there just from sheer repetition. You know, if you follow a specific comedian, like myself, say someone like Brian Posehn, who I absolutely love, there's things that he still does that surprises me, but I can see, you know, what his style, what his structure is. And there are times when I can see see the punchline coming. In fact, there are two different Brian Poseins on any show that I've watched, and when I've seen him live, and I've seen him live a couple times. There's the guy that is the comedian who is coming up, and every so often you can feel the layup and then the dunk of the punchline coming. And then there's the guy who's just the silly nerd who's up there, and he goes into these crazy side things, and it's part of his show. It's not like he's losing it or riffing up there, but there are moments where he's going to go for the solid joke, which is the standard thing, to make sure that you know that he understands joke structure, and then there's the rest of them. And that's the stuff that's fun. So if you're looking at comedy, you study it your whole life, you're going to get those rhythms down. You're going to know it just by repetition. You're going to see that punchline coming. It's the same with horror movies. Your scars are really hard to come by if you see them coming from a mile away. If you go, okay, I see how this shot is framed, and just the way that it's shot in the rule of threes or the rule of thirds, where you have the screen broken up in 3 different slots. Well, actually, it's 9 different slots. Let's not get too academic about it. But anyway, you're going to have 1/3 of the screen, usually to the side, being the primary thing that draws your eye, which means there's going to be all this empty space behind you waiting for the killer to show up in that empty space. That's the kind of thing that we talk about. So we see that coming a mile away. We value the element of surprise as much as we do a heart-stopping scare. So if we get that idea that there's going to be that scare there, and you somehow surprise us by not having that scare happen right at that moment, we will try and reward that for you. As a filmmaker, the film goer is going to want to really be in your court. Surprises in comedy, they make fans laugh. Horror, of course, same element of surprise, except it comes from another direction, comes from a scream. And, there's a big incentive for genre filmmakers to aim high. You're going to want to try and surprise fans. It should be the baseline that you should be wanting to go to. Because if you show us something that we've never seen before, your box office is going to go up. It's just that simple. We are hungry for those moments that are completely different than what we've seen before, or scenes that are done so immaculately that we're like going, oh man, that is like the best wine I've ever had in my life. If you hit it out of the park, we are going to become hopelessly devoted to you. And what I mean by hopeless devotion from a horror fan, if you jazz us, I can tell you it works with me. If you jazz me in either way, you get me excited and happy, I'm going to follow your work for years afterward. I'm going to go back. I'm going to look at all of your work. Dedicated horror fans tend to be completists. Now, for me, if a director makes a movie I love, I go back. Like I said, I'll watch everything. I'll follow their career for the rest of their life. Now, that becomes a real fucking slog if you're, Jess Franco or Joe D'Amato. These guys made hundreds of films between the two of them. If you just call both of them people that you absolutely love, you've got like 400 movies to watch. So, yeah, it could be really tough. But you know what? The thing about completism is that we never really want to complete. I mean, complete is essentially your feet are in the soil, right? You're 6 feet under, your toes up, because you're never going to get everything in this world. If they stop making horror movies today, I still wouldn't see everything that has been made since the silent era. There's that much out there, and there's so much that is available now. So we never will complete the journey. But we secretly hope that as we are toiling through all of these movies that we want to watch, and we habitually go towards these, and we want to find the new stars, and we want to find that element of surprise, we're always looking for one more movie that we still need to see. And, we have a thrill that comes from that. And how far will some of us go to catch that thrill? Well, we go pretty damn far. If you're of my time period, back in the 80s and the 90s, like you're growing up in the 80s and the 90s, I was first generation VCR, I guess is the way you could say it. First people who could actually rent a movie that you saw in the theater. You had the movies that were in the video stores, but you were reading about all these other movies in different magazines, Deep Red magazines, stuff like that. You're looking at this stuff. Fangoria, Film Threat was another great one to find these movies where they'd be talking about them, and you could go to your mom and pop store and they never even heard of them. They never even heard of like Sub Rosa Pictures or Barrel. It's like, what are those? That I don't know what these labels are. So when we would come in something like that, movies that say were never released in the United States or movies that were no longer available, we found ourselves in, the gray market, which is someone somewhere has a copy and they dub it down into another VHS, sometimes an SLP, which means that you can get 3 movies on the same 120-minute tape, which means if you try to fast forward, you've gone through half of the movie in 10 seconds. You're like, what the fuck just happened? And it looks muddy and everything like that, but we're going to watch. And you'd watch the shittiest looking transfers because you want to watch movies that you've heard about certain scenes in. These things that are hopefully going to surprise you when you watch them, that you're just going to have your jaw drop. We obsessively search for these movies, and because these movies had mythic reputations, they promised us something unpredictable. They promised us a little bit of danger. They promised us that maybe we would be offended at some point, but certainly what we were getting was something that was unlike what we had seen before. We still go the extra mile. We're going to invest our time and our effort to find a movie that's going to, shock us. And if you shock us, you surprise us, we are going to reward that filmmaker. We will do everything we can to spread the gospel. The gospel of good scare is going to make its way through any convention. We're going to do everything that we can to spread that gospel if you actually get us excited. And it's also, I think, why so many directors, first-time directors, want to make horror movies, because fandom for horror is evergreen. Die-hard horror fans are going to try out just about anything that opens. We'll give a new, unknown indie movie a chance, because deep down we're all romantics. We want to fall in love with your movie. We want to die for it. It's incredible how often directors and producers, knowing that, they squander our enthusiasm by trying to pass off some predictable, boring photocopy of a far better film that we've seen before and has already been copied a million times. So at the most fundamental level, hello, horror filmmakers out there, horror filmmakers need to know the audience. They need to understand horror fans' expectations and how to manage those expectations. Because horror, just like comedy, you need to surprise the audience to be effective. Now, I will put in some caveats. Know the audience. The audience has to know if they're the audience or not as well. I think that's one of the things that we're hitting right now. Being a man of a certain age, many of the horror fans of my age are starting to sound an awful lot like Bosley Crowther when he watched Bonnie and Clyde the first time. So there is going to be this thing where it's a ride or die thing with horror, my friends. Quite honestly, if you're my age, if you're in your 50s, you're not the audience anymore, my friend. I don't know how to tell you that. The audience is younger. Repeat offenders. Those people will go and watch the movie again and again and again. That's the audience they're trying to catch. If we come along for the ride, that's great as well. Horror is always evolving, and we need to evolve with it. Now, after that caveat, let's roll right back through that, and let's talk once again about what the horror filmmakers need to do. You need to know your audience. You need to understand the expectations, and how you're going to manage those expectations is going to be whether or not you actually make people happy and you make yourself happy because you've made a hit film, or you've just made a movie that everybody's going to love. So, in my sort of humble opinion, there are 3 approaches to managing expectations, and I call them the 3 doors of death. 1, meeting expectations. 2, subverting expectations. And 3, ignoring the fuck out of expectations. So let's start with door number 1, meeting expectations. Now, it's essentially as easy as giving the audience what you advertised, right? There is nothing wrong with a good, simple story told well. It does not have to be complicated. You can breathe a breath of fresh air just by telling the story in an elegant fashion. Some story setups are timeless, and they don't need to really be changed, or it feels weird if they do get changed. And we admire a movie that hits those classic beats and gives us that solid classic vibe, as long as the film strives for the quality, the excellence that made those stories timeless. In other words, you're going to have to do as well as the movie that you mimic, right? It has to feel that way. Or the story. If you're going for a classic story, you have to try and make it as classically strong as you can. And that has to do with quality that makes these stories what they were. Can we make it a bare minimum requirement that the movie needs to live up to its trailer? Is that too much to ask? Can we make that a bare minimum requirement? Can you folks make a movie that lives up to the trailer? Whatever mood or excitement the trailer generates, that's it, folks. The film has to fulfill that contract. Too many times the best parts of the movies are in the trailer. We all know this. That doesn't meet our expectations, And what's a great example? A really good example of how you can just drop the ball. You can have everything set up. You've got expectations going and just fucking drop the ball would be Snakes on a Plane. Now, Snakes on a Plane is a strong case of not living up to your trailer, your hype, or even a meme. The movie started with a meme. It's generally agreed that this is probably the most internet-hyped movie ever, Snakes on a Plane. It really started as a blog post by the screenwriter, Josh Friedman. The principal photography had wrapped. It was a PG-13 thriller with a funny name. And it became a cultural phenomenon that was bound to disappoint because this blog post, which I'm going to quote here, he wrote, "It's a title, it's a concept, it's a poster and a log line and whatever else you need it to be. It's perfect. It's the everlasting gobstopper of movie titles." And then he made the parody meme that everybody went viral with, a photo of Samuel L. Jackson saying, "There are motherfucking snakes on this motherfucking plane." Now, when that went viral, it started buzz that was unexpected. The producers, the director, the actors, nobody was ready for it. They didn't know what they were in for. The buzz suddenly went way past the expectations of the filmmakers. So horror, action genre, you mix those two, it's going to be something big. So as the weeks went by after that buzz and the viral meme and the movie hadn't opened yet, anticipation is going through the roof. And it was like we were all expecting a movie that was not the one that they shot, but we were expecting the movie that they advertised in that meme. Not even to the trailer yet, just the meme. We already wrote the movie in a weird way, so we expected a movie that was going to be self-aware, an ironic B movie that was going to be a bit of a gore fest. It was going to be a cult trash classic. It was going to be nasty, gory, and funny, and it was going to do stuff that was just going to be a little bit outrageous. The big problem with that wasn't the movie that they made. And the thing was, when they realized that the hype was really getting high, they said, we better do some reshoots. So they had 5 days of reshoots, and they were trying to capitalize on the weird-ass luck. They stepped in shit, and all of a sudden they had all of this heat for a movie that wasn't the one that they made. So they added some gruesome shit. They added a little bit of sleaze. But you know what? It was just kind of tacked on. And what people saw was not the thing that was in their head, what they got from the meme, what they ended up getting from the trailer. All of that stuff with the motherfucking snakes and the motherfucking plane went and was like a sour note. It's just another mediocre thriller, a mildly imaginative plot line, but it was really, what I like to call the beige town car. It's just a beige town car. It's fine. It'll get you where you need to go, and you're not going to remember the ride. And that's sadly what ended up happening. Now, that's not managing the expectation. It's not at least hitting the expectation that was there. But there are movies that do that extremely well. So, yes, Snakes on a Plane did not meet expectations. But then you get something like the excellent Australian independent horror film Talk to Me. Now, this takes a standard horror concept and it makes it immaculate with just a few cosmetic tucks here and there for timeliness, setting it in a more contemporary time. The setup's one of the oldest that there is in horror. It's a group of kids play with forces they don't understand. They want to talk to the dead, and they did not expect the dead to talk back. So instead of a Ouija board, we have one of the kids that carries around a plaster cast of an embalmed arm with an outstretched hand. And, it's creepy And the little legend behind it is that there's actually an arm inside of that cast. It's from a witch. And so, it sounds like something a kid would say. It also sounds like every great myth you've ever heard, every great ghost story that you've ever read starts with something like that. We are firmly grounded in an M.R. Jamesian ghost story with this movie, Talk to Me. We have a cursed object, and we have a supernatural force that's attached to it. However, instead of it being, instead of the human monkey's paw, let's call it a monkey's paw, being treated as a dangerous talisman, as most of these stories do, like do not touch, do not do this, do not do that. It's a party trick. And that is really kind of clever. It says a lot about where we are as a culture. It says a lot about the carelessness and how common danger is, and how risk is just part of life. And the thing is, it's a party trick, and the owner is a teenage boy, right? He carries it around from party to party. He's trying to find new people to play with. And instead of that making him a weirdo, it makes him popular. Think of that arm as being the best pot that anybody has ever bought. And he's just taking it from party to party and saying, who wants a hit? It's pretty much kind of like that. And, the arm itself, it's plastered, it's covered with graffiti scrawls from people who signed it after they played with the dead a little bit. Now, it's a horror movie, right? So as one would expect in a horror movie, dealing with the dead involves rules of engagement. And this is where it falls back into classical mode. We go back more into the rules of engagement you see all the time. So the engagement is the participant has to grab the plaster hand and say, talk to me. And they are hit with this psychic rush at that point, as if they got that harsh toke off of a bong. The surrounding party guests, they all laugh with recognition. It's kind of like, now I don't want to, I am dating myself no matter what, and I don't try this at home, kids, but we used to do whippets a lot. And essentially, I used to work at when I didn't have the actual whippets, we used to improvise. And I used to work at a family restaurant. And they used to have pies, and they would have the whipped cream containers. And essentially, there was always extra CO2. I can't remember. Is it CO2? I guess it is. That was in those canisters that held all the ready whipped cream. And so us wonderful busboys and short order cooks would sit in the back and take a penknife and just squeeze on down and suck up some of that as it was shooting through, and you would get this incredible rush. And everybody would laugh. They'd look at you and go, whoa. A more innocent thing of that was when you were a smaller kid and they spun you on a swing forever at the playground, and then you got off and you tried to walk, and everybody was like, whoa. Well, that's the same way that they're treating this playing with the dead. And so I really love that. The surrounding party guests are laughing. All of it seems like fun, but there's a second part to this ritual, as there normally is when you're talking about rules of engagement. The participant then has to say, I let you in. And at that point, the entity from the other side takes the bait. It's like it's bait, bringing a live human for it to interact with. It enters the participant and it possesses them. So everyone laughs, right? So they're possessed. There's a spirit inside of the body, and everybody, instead of thinking that it's like a possession or a bedevilment, they act like they're watching a drunk friend trying to walk across the room, or like the kid on the swing getting spun around trying to walk across the park. So, of course, how does this go wrong, right? Well, you have to have a little bit more of a rule of engagement. The other side has its rules. So it is explicitly crucial that the spirit is not allowed inside the participant's body for more than 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Why 90 seconds? Who the fuck cares? Nobody knows. I remember Guillermo del Toro talking about Pan's Labyrinth and how you have the three fairies that are in there, and the sleeping gray man at the table. And he said, this is a very reminiscent of my grandmother's story to me about how to get a wish granted. You had to find the devil sleeping. You had to pull 3 hairs out of his back. And it's like, why 3? Who the fuck knows? It's just how all these stories go. It's 3. So the other side has this third rule. Don't go for more than 90 seconds. Like playing around with drugs, the risk and the potential danger is what makes it all the more fun, more provocative. Teenagers know the rules, right? So what could possibly fucking go wrong? Well, yeah, guess, right? So even though Talk to Me follows one of the oldest setups in the horror playbook, it does so with a lot of skill. And it does so with a genuine sincerity for the idea. And the directors, Danny and Michael Philippou, they're brothers, they understand what makes this setup so compelling. And what I think is the greatness to the story is that, in youth, we're ignorant of the silent presence of death. And until we respect death, we cannot respect life. And so the filmmakers lean into that idea, and they create a very believable group of characters that are going through this. So the teens very much feel like teens. The adults very much feel like adults, not movie adults. Mom is just a slightly older teenager, and that feels very, very prescient to most people's families. And these teens, the way that they act, they starve to belong. They risk harming themselves to shine just for one brief moment in front of everybody. And I think probably most of us can relate to that. Everything about the relationships between the parents and the teenagers rings true. And I think it was really smart of the filmmakers as well to not get caught up in, the super exorcist kind of ideas of possession. They kept everything. The possession sequences were very small. They're really intimate. They're physically subtle. The whole thing of the Talk to Me thing is the biggest effect is contact lenses. It's that make it look like they have extremely dilated pupils. So the rest of the effect that's being done has nothing to do with prosthetics or CGI. It's purely acting. And that helps make everything feel really unique and authentic. They take that subject matter seriously, the directors. They create a realistic world. They understand their characters. So when the supernatural stuff finally shows up, it gets really believable, even though the violence is really over the top in some areas and pretty terrifying. How old is this story, right? This is an expectation that goes all the way back to 1936. Ronal Kayser wrote the Séance. That's the granddaddy of all these restless spirit stories. So Talk to Me makes cosmetic updates to that structure, but the truth is that Talk to Me is that old of a story, but it doesn't need to reinvent that wheel. It just needs to know how to make that wheel roll along smoothly. The final moments of that movie harken back to literally a literary ghost story. It feels like H.L. Mencken, M.R. James coming to life. That movie has a well-deserved, profound ending that feels like every old ghost story you've ever read. And it's so wonderful. So Talk to Me is an excellent example of successfully walking through that first door of death. And that first door of death is meeting expectations. So the first door of death is meeting audience expectations, meeting the expectations. Now the second door subverts expectations. So subverting expectations is kind of like a rite of passage in horror movies. It's kind of the moment when the filmmakers themselves realize how old the idea is. They get as bored with the limitations of the same tropes. They're just as bored with it as the audience is, and they decide to do something about it. They find new ways to present what works out of those tropes, and they throw everything else out, and they just keep the fresh perspective. Sometimes the best way to shake up audience expectations is like changing from within, changing the creature canon. So one of the most sacred things, right? You start dealing with the creature and what the creature's supposed to do and what the moon's supposed to do to it and what color it is and all of that. Oh my goodness, you start playing with the creature canon, you're taking chances. But This is how horror evolves. So take zombies as an example. Now, 1943, I Walk with a Zombie. You know, the titular character is a cursed, reanimated slave. You know, his slow lumbering through the woods at night is more tragic romanticism than it is scary. However, the way that movie's shot, there are some really scary moments in how that character looks. Now, that's what a zombie was for the longest time. George Romero talked about it. Romero was saying, you know, when I was growing up, the zombie was a working stiff. He was the guy up on the plantation. The white collar criminals were making him do all this stuff, and so George Romero decided to make the zombie still blue collar, but be a little bit different. He takes that shambling zombie, reinvents it, adds the ghoul character. So the characteristics of what was known as a ghoul, the flesh eater, the thing that was always in the cemeteries eating stuff. He put that on the zombie and created Night of the Living Dead. And it changed the creature canon forever. You really can't go back to that romantic zombie of the 30s. It doesn't seem to really hold much resonance. So what happens with the zombie? Well, say 28 days later. And yes, I know everybody goes, oh my God, that's not really a zombie movie. It's rage. Rage is somehow the poetic idea of rage becoming a disease that infects everybody. Now, with that said, great. We can split hairs if you want, but to me, 28 days later feels like a reinvention of the zombie where you weren't stuck with all of the zombie canon. You just changed up what the disease was, whatever the malady was. So yes, it's rage and everything, but they're zombies, right? When you're watching the movie, you're not going, I've never seen. No, you fucking go right to zombie, okay? Whether it's rage or whatever, when the guy's going like that, you're thinking zombie. Now, you're still thinking zombie, right? Your mind is still making that connection, and that's where Danny Boyle really kicks you in the nuts, because then he introduces speed to the zombies. So now the zombies can run down victims, right? And I remember the first scene in that movie where the guys are on fire. The zombie-esque rage boys are on fire because of Molotov cocktails, and they're still chasing the main character. And they're sprinting after him. Whoever did those fire stunt effects, holy shit, that was amazing. Now, that was the jaw dropper, though. I leaned in instead of sitting there going, God damn it, all my zombies must be slow. And some people did, They didn't do it so much with 28 Days Later, but they did do it to Zack Snyder's movie. So Dawn of the Dead. That fast zombie continued into Dawn of the Dead. And then there was this banging of heads around canon. And you know what? I have no problems with slow zombies. I love slow zombies, but I also like fast zombies. All depends on the situation. It's kind of like I love cinema. I love film, celluloid, but I also can handle shot on video. And it depends on how the shot on video is done. So 28 Days Later did not bother me when it was on digital video, right? It was like one of the first Sony DV cameras. And so it has a certain look, but what it does is, and we're going to come back to this as this essay that I'm doing here, essay continues on, how much technology changes. The language of cinema changes as much as the language does in actual speaking. The thing is, there's always a change happening. There are shortcuts to entire sentences that we use. And it happens in cinema as well. As the technology changes, the visual language changes, the mental language changes. So 28 Days Later feels very much like a 9/11 film. It has many little stingers in it that remind you of 9/11. The empty airport and hotel and hospitals, and Piccadilly Square is empty, and all of the pictures that are up on the billboards of people who are missing. That's very, very provocative of 9/11. But it's also the idea that was televised so much. That was the first major disaster that I think we saw from the point of view of passersby and stuff. You had so much video. People had video cameras, and they were taking video of this, and it had that raw, shaky, ugly look, and that became reality. And so 28 Days Later actually feels more realistic at times because of what it's talking about and the look that's in it, meeting that expectation as well as subverting that expectation in some ways, because we expect a film to look like a film. Dawn of the Dead, Zack Snyder's, I love it, by the way. Those movies subvert, each one of them, the original idea of the zombie. I Walk with a Zombie, to Night of the Living Dead, to 28 Days Later, to Dawn of the Dead, and then onward and upward. Using this as an example of subverting expectations. Changing the canon of the monster can sometimes refresh and revitalize an old idea, as long as the idea was good in the first place. Right? Vampires change with the times. The filmmakers subvert expectations more by daring to change the vampire folklore, right? So you can change whether it's Transylvania, or it's the United States, or it's the New England town, or it's the middle of Manhattan. But what really makes the change is when the folklore starts to switch around. Crosses, garlic, holy water. Hey, they aren't going to cut it against many of the revamped vamps that are out there. Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark, right? Daylight is still fatal to vampires in fascinating and truly cinematic ways in that film. But the vampires don't have fangs as far as we know. And they cast reflections. Crosses never even enter the story. They're still blood drinkers, though. Near Dark also does something I like to call the chocolate and peanut buttering of a story. Taking two ideas, two genres, or multiple genres, and creating something unique. Putting that chocolate into the peanut butter, and all of a sudden you got something cool. Near Dark combines a road picture, a Western, and a horror movie, and it drops the mixture into the outlaw storyline of Bonnie and Clyde. And you put all of that together and you get something really fucking cool. And that's why I love Near Dark. And some people talk about like it's the trailer trash vampire movie. I'm fine with you using a pejorative like that, I guess. But I think it's really an outlaw film. And I love the idea of it. And I love that it is kind of like a murder spree, kind of Badlands or Bonnie and Clyde kind of story, and done with vampires. But I think the thing that really makes that is that even though you are never really sitting there going, maybe, I don't know, maybe the Bram Stoker family might be going, fuck this movie. But I think most people were able to realize that there was enough of an adherence to what makes vampires really interesting, and then also played with the folklore in a way that made it surprising, subverting the expectations once again. The same year that movie comes out, you have The Lost Boys. And that combines like Rebel Without a Cause with MTV style videos, music videos, and gave traditional vampires, a makeover. They had a very colorful 80s like makeover. They really leaned into the beauty. That's one thing that I will say for Joel Schumacher on that. He uses a great location, Santa Cruz, with all its fog and its beaches. And it's a very hippie college town and a lot of townies. So there's kind of this blue collar look to it. And so he uses that, but he's also leaning right into the fact that the Brat Pack had just happened, right? And teen movies had suddenly exploded, and beautiful faces were now the leads in a way that was like almost model perfect. So you had all these really, really beautiful faces in that movie, and they wore model-like clothes. They throw a whole bunch of stuff in. I think all of these filmmakers who decide to subvert expectations, and that's, once again, how horror grows, right? Upstart genre filmmakers like your mom with Leftovers. They're going to use whatever meat is left on the bone. They're going to combine it with whatever else is in the fridge. They're going to make some kind of fantastic casserole. You're like going, where did this come from? Let's try the slasher film, the most simple, controversial, popular horror subgenre that's out there, the slasher film. And this is how I think maybe I can explain better about subverting expectations helps make something old feel new again. Like Jason Voorhees, the subgenre of slashers itself, it rises from the dead over the decades. And I think the reason that it comes back every so often is a hint of nostalgia, a hint of mystery of what maybe younger generations feel they missed with the slasher because it had such a controversial thing to it. And just some tweaks to the template. Oddly enough, the slasher's roots are not in the horror genre, really, but they're in the mystery genre. Specifically, Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, her 1939 novel. It's remembered today as 10 Little Indians because all the movies and plays and everything that came out of it were called 10 Little Indians. So why that one is such a watershed book. Previous mystery novels revolved around a single murder and multiple suspects. See, 10 Little Indians, however, breaks from that model. It subverts expectations by having a series of murders occur to multiple suspects, right? So there's 10 strangers. They receive invitations to a mansion on a secluded island. They get there. The mysterious host is nowhere to be found, except there's a recorded message. And on that message, it accuses each of the guests that come to that island of serious crimes that they all got away with. And one by one, the guests are killed. And the killing is somewhat bizarre. The manners get more bizarre as it goes because they go with a nursery rhyme that hangs in every room. So the structural twist, it changes from the predictable idea of the drawing room murder investigation that Agatha Christie made popular herself as well. And it turned it into a race to find the killer before he kills off everybody in the story. So Agatha Christie changed the intellectual exercise of whodunits and turned it into something visceral. It went from intellectual to visceral because it goes from whodunit to who is doing this. So it's happening in the now. It's happening as you're reading, not something in the past. In doing so, that helped create the idea of, I guess, the thriller. Maybe that's what a thriller is, huh? So in a few decades, thrillers are going to take this really twisty path through Wait Until Dark and stuff like that and evolve into slashers. Now, I think there's a lot of debate over which film is the first slasher, but if I had to put money down on it, I would say Twitch of the Death Nerve, directed by legendary Mario Bava, Italian director. It's also known as A Bay of Blood. You may have seen it by that title. So that was 1971. So from like 1939 to 1971, we had this evolution from a mystery to a thriller to something that's a slasher. And a little bit in there is giallo. We'll talk a little bit about that too. Now, the thing that's interesting about Twitch of the Death Nerve and why I consider that the first slasher has to do with kind of the historical way that the director Bava was working and stuff, and how much of a controversial kind of switch in his style Twitch of the Death Nerve was. So Bava was a crucial figure in early Italian cinema. And he started as a cinematographer, and he started as a special effects artist in the 40s and the 50s. And he directed his first credited feature, Black Sunday, in 1960. And he was trained as a painter, so his movies, Black Sabbath, Blood and Black Lace especially, Kill Baby Kill as well, they're legendary for immaculate composition, use of light and color. If it's black and white, use of shading, and a lot of stylized violence. His violence is really kind of itchy, over the top. I like to call it itchy, like when you're watching Barbara Steele get that fucking Iron Maiden mask put on her face. You feel it when that big mallet goes in there. That was something that you might see in biblical stories. For some reason, biblical movies used to be able to get away with crazy violence like that. But his movies had that stylized violence, and it was never super explicit, but it was more than what was normal, and that caught your eye. Kind of like how Hammer films when they had Kensington gore. So anyway, this idea of Bava's technique, he helped create what ended up being the giallo genre, a hybrid of mystery and horror films. The violence goes way up. The stylization goes way up as well. And so a lot of people credit giallo as the Italian progenitor to the American slasher. So where Blood and Black Lace exudes just unbelievably beautiful, almost 3D images, this Bava flair. Even the violence is glamorous. There's like a sexiness to the violence. There's that in Blood and Black Lace. But Twitch of the Death Nerve is the exact opposite. It is uncharacteristically brutal. It's seedy. The whole thing feels like it has a sheen of sweat on it. And it's shockingly gory, especially for 1971. The plot follows the 10 Little Indians template. It's a murder of a countess, brings a bunch of people to claim her estate, and they get on that island, and they are just graphically julienned and sliced and diced and blended. They're just torn to pieces by an unseen killer. There are set pieces that are in there. There's a guy that gets his face split in two with a hatchet. There's a beheading, and when the head comes off, the body like lurches forward and the arterial blood shoots towards the camera. There's two people who are impaled with a spear during sex. And this was something that was repeated, went into the slasher films of the 80s. I mean, really kind of huge homages in some way. I think Friday the 13th Part 2 has the spear going through two people who are having sex. Now, that was big in the 80s, but that kind of carnage just wasn't around in 1971. And even more interesting, in Bava's films. Bava did not do that kind of thing until Twitch of the Death Nerve. You can say that he had gut-churning violence at certain points, but the visuals did not match the feel that Bava was usually going for. And so what's interesting is Bava recognized that the culture and cinematic tastes were starting to change. And he took a chance. He subverted the fans' expectations of giallo films. And in a way, he unintentionally probably, I can't speak for Mario Bava, but I think he unintentionally laid the groundwork for the slasher. I think he made his movie, he made his point. He took things too far, I think intentionally. So when the movie came out, film critics who loved his old stuff and supported his earlier work rejected it, right? And the fans who were normally fans of his movies, they were offended by it, or they didn't support it. Now, cut ahead 10, 20 years later, the movie is now revered because of its place in horror cinema history. It's this kind of little hidden horror that takes an older idea and turns it into what becomes a slasher. Now, if we're going to talk slashers, we've got to talk about certain movies, right? So the influence of John Carpenter's Halloween, I think that influence is more cosmetic. I don't think Carpenter's Halloween has the attitude and mindset that I would personify as a slasher. I think its biggest influences were that it was really cheap to make, it had an easily repeatable formula, it made a ton of money, and it was set on a holiday, right? And it had a masked killer. So those things were things that other filmmakers are going to use ad infinitum up to this day, and even Halloween itself is cannibalizing Halloween. But the original film just wants to be a spooky suspense movie with a supernatural bend to it. A lot of the scariness comes from the power of suggestion in that movie. Less is more. And less is more is not the mission statement of a slasher film. Slasher films are more is more. The strongest and longest lasting influence on slashers comes from Friday the 13th, the original, 1980. That movie started as a teaser poster to gauge audience interest on that title. The response was super positive. So they put it in movie theaters. They played this trailer. They just had that glass get shattered by the word Friday the 13th coming through. And people were like, I got to see that. And so producer, director Sean Cunningham wrote a script. He decided to go toward the more is more excess. And that is the excess of, say, Bava's Twitch of the Death Nerve. He copied the 10 Little Indian structure. I mean, even borrowed some of the violent kills that were used in Twitch of the Death Nerve. So timing is everything. And what backfired on Bava in 1971, 9 years later, was pay dirt for Cunningham. He has an entire career and a franchise and probably 20 houses because of what he did to Twitch of the Death Nerve and turn it into Friday the 13th. So Friday the 13th to say the least, it caught everybody by surprise, right? I mean, it was a trailer and it became this movie. So people went to see Friday the 13th expecting it to be still in that mold of Halloween where we're going to be, it'll be reserved. And that is not what we got. Friday the 13th was cinematic anarchy. I consider that the punk rock movie, the first real big punk rock horror movie. Movie didn't feel like a studio released it, and it felt like it escaped from a mental ward. It was wish fulfillment of every horror fan, that wish fulfillment of gore and carnage that we imagined when we were watching older films, when we were watching Bava films. We imagined what was happening to Barbara Steele's face. We never thought anybody crazy enough to show us what happened, but that's what happened. The rules no longer applied. Friday the 13th seemed really dangerous in a way that I think only a handful of movies, like, say, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, felt at that time. Now, that was a huge success, right? Friday the 13th opened the floodgates for tons of slasher films, mostly following that revised horror formula, right? Many of these movies took place around a holiday or a special event. Special events or holidays. It's time for a slasher. Prom night, New Year's Evil, My Bloody Valentine, Happy Birthday to Me. Most of these movies also use the 10 Little Indians revenge template, where someone, usually an outsider, the loner, the wallflower, they had a prank played on them, and it either injured or killed them, but of course didn't, or it killed a family member and it was revenge. So The Burning, The Prowler, both really good ones. Hell Night, Final Exam. Now, every single one of the slasher films had a masked killer, and the masks got more elaborate, but it was the same template, right? Multiple weapons are being used off teenagers. How closely were slasher films adhering to a new formula, right? Which is why I ran out of steam on the slasher within the first 2 years of them. After 1982, 83, they really started feeling derivative. So there was a documentary. If you haven't seen it, you should watch Going to Pieces, The Rise and Fall of the Slasher film. It came out in 2006. And whether you're a slasher fan or not, it's well worth taking a look at the documentation that there is around the slasher film. So Herb Fried was the director and the writer of Graduation Day. Not one of the high points, but he talked about taking on that assignment. And so let me quote that. We went to see Halloween and Friday the 13th, and we just saw how these things were constructed. And if you watch carefully and you watch several times, you see that you have to have a build-up to horror activity, to some kind of massacre, and then it continues on. And essentially, he said every 5 minutes you had to kill somebody. Fried admitted he took a stopwatch into the movie theater and recorded how much time passed between the murders, so that he essentially said, okay, it's a 5-minute fucking deal we got here. And he said they all had to fit that particular pattern, and every couple of minutes you got to have something to fit that genre. Now, he no longer makes movies. He's now a Rabbi Fried, and he said that there's a great expression in Hebrew, which is, it was good, but it's good that it was. And so the slasher film is a sign of how we can go absolutely crazy if you just subvert something that feels tired. But anyway, get back to our Doors of Death. I know this one's going long. I haven't been on for a while, folks, so I think you guys deserve a little bit longer. If this is going to kill you, I do apologize. But we're going to go on. First two Doors of Death, they understand the horror's audience expectations. They either meet those expectations or they subvert them. Ultimately, the first two doors, Door 1 and Door 2, they respect the audience's expectations, right? Door 3 does not. So instead of meeting or subverting expectations, the third Door of Death ignores them. The filmmakers who make these movies, the movies that pass through Door 3, they're essentially rejecting the traditions and the guidelines. And they are aggressive in that. They aggressively criticize the things that went before them. They kind of bite the hand that feeds in some ways. Their visions radically differ from what the audience expectations are. And that's usually very divisive. Some fans will flock to these movies once they see that someone has kicked over the chessboard. And others get very vocal about hating that. Like, hey, that's not how you play chess, motherfucker. Now, the arguments around these movies, because of the nature of what they're trying to do, they are provocative. The arguments get heated. So you know what? For horror to truly evolve, these movies need to happen. You need to have these movies that just say, fuck it, I'm going to try something else. And some people are going to get it and other people won't. And it very much reminds me of talking about punk rock in a documentary. Henry Rollins is being interviewed and he goes, you know, it just takes one person to say, fuck you, I'm not going to do what you say. And then someone else goes, holy shit, that's exactly how I feel. Voice of a generation. And just like that, you move on to the next generation. And actually, punk rock's a great thing to talk about with this because, you know, a lot of the people who were the original punk rockers are like, you know, I really didn't have anything against the Beatles. I didn't have anything against Led Zeppelin and stuff. It's just we were tired of them. And the fucking older generation wouldn't let go. They just kept holding on to the airwaves, and there was no music for us. They had those bands when they were 15 and 16. What am I getting when I'm 15 and 16? I'm getting Peter Frampton in a fucking kimono. Give me a fucking break. So they ended up making their own shit, right? And so I believe that these kicks in the teeth happen because we won't let go. And so this is probably going to be a door that's going to get me some hate mail. You know what? Evolve or die, motherfucker. Now, ironically enough, Door 3 movies happen when there's just too many of Door 1 and Door 2 movies to go around. But there's a fine line between giving audiences what they want and fucking pandering to them. And I think the phenomenon of tipping over into the pandering zone happens gradually. You know, the filmmakers in the studios, they don't want to kill the golden goose. But I think that might be inevitable. Why is that? Because we find a sweet spot. Finding that sweet spot doesn't happen overnight. It takes forever sometimes. Finding the sweet spot of what an audience expects and wants takes time. So once you find that, it's beneficial for everyone to just stick to it. I don't need to move left or right. Right here, this is the place where if we scratch, we're getting the itch and everybody's really happy. You know, nothing succeeds like success does. So the audience is happy to get that, right? They want the itch scratched. They want what they want. They're happy to get what they want. But unfortunately, as time goes by, you know, the audience ages. The sweet spot becomes comfortable and nostalgic entertainment. And the industry will stay there for them. Hey, if that's working, let's just keep doing that. Rocky 12 sounds like a great idea. And then, just like that, everything stays the same. Now, horror movies in particular, I think, do stagnate in complacency. It's so funny because we're the bad boys, right? We're the outlaws. And yet, that sweet spot starts to rot pretty quick. Nobody notices it except for the next generation coming into their own. The next generation just doesn't relate to what their parents love. I don't know what it is. I don't know if there's any way we can keep from having it happen. I mean, it's like trying to figure out why certain music hit you when you were young. And then music will always be a big part of your life, but it will never be like that moment when you suddenly felt like you belonged because you heard that song and you suddenly realized it's yours. Stagnant art doesn't keep up with the changing culture. And before you know it, we become that generation that won't let go, that keeps talking about these movies from the 80s because they were so great. And yet they were great to us. And they were great to us because they were a great bookmark of the times. They were a blueprint. Often art doesn't keep up with the changing culture. It becomes a sanctuary from a changing world. So we go back to those movies. You know, I owned a lot, let's just say a lot of movies on physical media. I will say I own these movies because they are something that I want to go back to. But it's a sanctuary from a changing world. It is a place that I know I can find an equilibrium, right? So those kind of movies don't represent the younger generation or their reality. we don't really get how much the world has changed. The little stressors. We don't get the little anxieties. We don't get the little weirdness and the complications and the absurdity, the things that don't make any fucking sense if you grew up like in the last 15 years. There's changes that we don't get because as we're older, we just go, oh, another change. We just sidestep it. We're back to thinking about what we're going to have for lunch. But if you're young, there's this fucking thing that looks really huge right in front of you. A lot of times, until the old generation finally lets go of the reins, these movies don't represent the younger generation or their reality. So anyway, my horror movies weren't for the younger generation. They just didn't connect in the same way. So what happens if the youth starts to feel neglected? That neglected audience is just dying to have something that they can call their own. And hey, once again, we go back to that punk rock comparison that I mentioned. The future belongs to the new generation, folks, whether you like it or not. And sometimes when those changes happen, it's like a real break, right? It's a drastic break. It can be pretty seismic. Unschiet Andalou, Andalusian Dog, 1929. The first surrealist film, essentially. It's not a full-length film. It's like 20-some minutes. But Andalusian Dog premieres in Paris. Louis Buñuel, Salvador Dali. They're the creators of it. And they leave the theater while the movie is going on. They go into the street, and they start filling their pockets with rocks, just in case the audience becomes physically violent over what they saw. So, much to Dolly's chagrin, he was actually hoping that there was going to be a riot. There wasn't one. Instead, people came out and they were confused. They were like, what the fuck did we just see? However, some people, although they didn't riot, they went to the police because it was obscene. It should be banned. While there was slight nudity, there's a really graphic bit of violence that most people know about, this sliced eyeball. But the thing that makes it feel obscene or dirty or unclean is that it doesn't follow a structure that everybody expects. It completely ignores expectations. It could give a fuck what the audience thought it wanted to see. And it decided to try something else, something that was stewing underneath the culture the entire time. So it wasn't just some kind of weird thing that was easily dismissible. This was something that stuck to people's ribs afterwards. They may not have liked what they saw. You can have something that you really have a strong opinion of, and you can still find yourself falling in love with it later because it is so against the grain of expectations at that time, so that it is somehow taking us in a direction we don't expect. It starts with a violent reaction. And then it becomes a passionate reaction. And let's face it, right? Horror, when it is at its best, rocks the boat, makes everybody uncomfortable. And it does so, it takes a decade or so. Innovations coming from fresh, young people. Subversives are usually young. They aren't sentimental about contemporary drama. And they usually start right where the previous upstarts stop being innovative and edgy. As soon as we started wanting our bellies rubbed, that's when this new breed comes in. The new breed can love the heart and soul of the movies that we champion for them. And they may love the revered classics in some way, but they clearly see what doesn't work anymore. I said this in my last book, I believe, which is if you are young and you don't understand why The Exorcist was supposed to be scary because cultural norms have changed drastically and we're in a more secular world, that's not your fault. However, if you are someone who lived through The Exorcist and are still watching horror movies now and you openly disregard the changes that are happening and you refuse to see anything good in them, that's your fucking fault. In horror, though, regime changes are how the genre advances. It's like you kind of need a coup, I guess. I think it was inevitable that you get a movie like The Blair Witch Project. The American horror movie landscape of the 90s, there were great, I'm going to do a podcast in the future because I've shat on the 90s a lot. Everybody I know shits on the 90s. Compared to the 80s, it's a very barren decade of horror films, but there are some really good ones in there. And I think I should really acknowledge some of those. But for the sake of this conversation, we're going to talk about how Silence of the Lambs wins Best Picture And all of a sudden, horror movies become psychological thrillers. Everything's about serial killers. Every movie seemed to be in the box office was about serial killers. I mean, there were some brilliant ones. I still love David Fincher's Seven. And yet, for the most part, we just got a lot of repetitions of the same story. The Minus Man, Color of Night, California, with a K. Those were, pretty much just, we're going to get in on that craze. And they focused on one thing. And then we have like Wes Craven's, it's self-referential Scream, but it's also brilliant. I will champion Scream all the time. It was what was needed. Things started to look up after Scream. But, whenever you have spectacular box office, which is what Scream did, it really handicapped low-budget independent horror films. So Scream inadvertently created a template that was medium budget studio films, teen models from television, the WB we used to joke about all the time. WB television models headlining revenge stories. So you had like I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend. So there's a lot of gloss, there was a lot of glamour, and it didn't feel very original. The studios and the distributors, they just let the smaller independent horror films sit on shelves. They shelved things just to show these bigger budget films. So, you had this gloss, you had this perfect Panaglide kind of thing to movies. You had people that had perfect skin. You had soundtracks that were completely from the beginning to the end of the movie, hard rock to medium rock songs. And so there's gloss and there's templates all over the place. And that all changes when the Legend of the Blair Witch captured everybody. So I love the Blair Witch. I think it gets a really bad rap, and I think part of that bad rap is because it is so experimental and was so different, and people felt absolutely betrayed. Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick are the co-creators of the Blair Witch, and they invented the Legend of the Blair Witch back in 1993. They were attending the University of Central Florida. Now, they may have invented it then, but the Blair Witch Project is the first horror film of the new millennium, 1999. It's the one that breaks cleanly from all the overused glossy conventions that were in the 90s. That whole end of an era, you could feel it. I don't think this horror movie gets recognized as the game changer it really was. I mean, not only did it kick off the found footage subgenre, which, your mileage may vary, but there's some brilliant stuff that goes on in there. A lot of crap, but brilliant stuff as well. Not only did it kick off the found footage subgenre, it's not the first, but it kicked it off. It did so in a very experimental fashion. It captured something uniquely visceral that try to repeat its structure and its magic miss. Somehow they can't get that unique visceral feel. The Blair Witch Project is easily one of the most experimental films ever released into mainstream theaters. Sanchez and Myrick came up with the idea when they realized that they both felt that documentaries about hauntings and possessions were scarier than movies, horror movies that were about them. The documentaries, the ghost hunters, the people walking into houses with those fucking shaky cams, they found that more realistic, more authentic, more like the news, right? So they came up with an idea that combined the two styles, the horror movie itself and the documentaries about hauntings. So they ended up writing a 35-page framework screenplay. That's all there was to that movie. It was about 3 film students who went missing in 1994 in the Black Hills of Maryland while they were making a documentary about the legend of the Blair Witch, which the two came up with in 1993 and just kept building on the entire time until they got this movie made. Now, the 3 film students in the movie were never found. That was the pitch that was there. Their equipment, their shot footage were found a year later, and the footage is the movie that you're watching. Now, I did want to mention something because you'll hear people say that The Last Broadcast is the first found footage movie, or they'll mention Cannibal Holocaust as a found footage movie. And I disagree. They have found footage aspects. Large swaths of the film are you watching film footage. But there is bookends that are not just like 2 or 3 minutes. There's like a whole big portion of a movie, a setup. Everything that is a normal, traditional setup of a movie starts and ends. Cannibal Holocaust starts and ends The Last Broadcast. In fact, The Last Broadcast is a documentary about a documentary. And so Blair Witch is the only one that starts with a little card that tells you what had happened. And the rest of it is literally the narrative of whatever was on the videotape as well as the film. If you're really looking at what the first found footage movie was, may I bring you to David Holzman's diary. That's 1966, I'll say. It's essentially a guy who's an actor who realizes that he's not getting any work, so he decides to make his life a movie. He has a film camera and he's speaking directly into it, and people walk in and they're like, what the hell's wrong with you? And then he starts filming people that don't know that they're being filmed, and it starts turning into a stalker film. It's more of a comedy. But at the same point, I would say that's the first found footage film. David Holzman's diary. You heard that here first. Anyway, let's get back to the Blair Witch. Why I think that this is the one that really kicks off the found footage is that literally the whole thing is found footage. There's no actors saying, we found this footage. There's no interviewing people. The only interviewing that's happening is the footage that was shot by the people who are missing. So narratively, we are literally in the only universe that exists in the woods. So most of the action, all of the dialogue, was going to be created on location with actors who had solid improvisation skills. They had to improvise very, very strongly. In fact, I think they had to do all sorts of stuff for the screen tests. The actors themselves are going to be recording the movie using a 16 millimeter film camera, a Nagra sound recorder, and a Hi-8 camcorder. So already the most experimental and risky thing that you could do. Oh, let's just put the equipment in the hands of the actors. Let's not give them dialogue. Let's leave them notes. And essentially, I think they had things like, it was an 8-day shoot. So the actors camped out there in the woods for the entire duration of the 8-day shoot. They would wake up to clues found in film canisters that gave them GPS coordinates to the next location. If they got lost, fuck it, that's now part of the movie. The actors had no clue what they were walking into. So essentially, if you're an actor in this movie, you were on a live stage, performing live for 8 days without a break. They're walking in. So everything that's happening, how are you not going to become more and more sensitive to that? How are you not going to have the lines between reality and fantasy blur? They had no clue what they were walking into. They'd get woken up in the middle of the night, something stalking them at the campsite. It's literally happening to them. Suddenly they have to react to people banging on the sides of the tent. Suddenly they have to react when somebody's hiding behind a bush. What the fuck is that? What the fuck is that? Literally wasn't supposed to happen. And she ended up seeing one of the people, one of the filmmakers crouching down. She just runs off into the woods. The most realistic fucking thing that could happen at that moment. I felt the chills. This was the idea of, fuck it, I'm getting out of here. So the shaky camera, all of that, none of that is an affectation. This is all literally happening to these people. The only thing is that they're never at risk. And the only big thing outside of that is that they are actively reacting. When people are banging on the tent, they don't go, fuck you, you're not paying me enough. Take two. They react. And that is stunning if you really think about it. There's real anxiety. There's real exhaustion. There's real fear getting recorded in that film. It was raw. It was strange. And it kept the audience off balance throughout. And sometimes literally off balance, like their inner ears were no longer working because of the shakiness of the shaky cam. It's funny how quickly our eyes and our brains get used to stuff like that. And there's been so many movies that have done the shaky camera and stuff like that. And you can say that, oh, the Blair Witch was worse. I don't really think so. I think what is worse is that everything feels very real in the Blair Witch Project. And that combined with the seasickness of that jolting camera was astonishing. It's a verisimilitude that found footage films that came after the Blair Witch Project just haven't really replicated. There's been a few that have been really good, but they've done it in their own way. I mean, this movie was about as far from what I Know What You Did Last Summer was as you could possibly get. But I think another key ingredient that made the movie a hit was the filmmakers' willingness to engage with the technology that was at the changing times, right? I mean, they engaged with the technology of all of them, the internet. You know, in 1999, that information highway, it's still pretty new. Nobody knew the untapped power that was there. They knew how to search it. They knew some things. You're getting connected. There were bulletin boards and stuff like that, but didn't really understand the power that there was, how everyone started to really find quick ways down rabbit holes. So the Blair Witch, it was the first movie to be effectively marketed primarily online. You know, the production created a website, and that website is notorious, right? It fashioned itself like it was a true crime missing person database. It was for a documentary, perhaps, had links to stuff that looked like authentic looking police reports. There were forensic photos, and of course the very famous missing poster of the 3 film students, right? The poster for the movie at some points. It was definitely in the ad campaign a whole bunch of times. There were interviews on that site. There were clips of the found footage. And I mean, the public relations team dug so deeply into this kind of thing. They went with it so deep. They marketed that they got the IMDb listings for the 3 actors to read missing, presumed dead. And that's pretty fucking phenomenal. That's crazy as well. By the time the film got widely released, that website, that really strange Blair Witch Project website, had like 160 million hits already. So, of course, some people believe the story was real, that the movie was on a documentary and nothing else, and that the actors were actually missing. And, you know, there was backlash. A lot of the backlash that there was against the Blair Witch Project was fans feeling duped. You know, they bought into something that wasn't real. The same thing, however, you know, if you're going to attack Sanchez and Myrick, you may as well go after that Orson Welles guy. You know, same thing happened in 1938. He did a live reading of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds on CBS radio. You know, some folks lost their minds. You know, some wanted Congress to get involved. Other people ate it up, couldn't wait to find out what was happening more. And even, you know, funnier with that is that if you ever listen to the actual War of the Worlds broadcast, every break they're saying this is a reenactment, this is an act, this is based on this book, and they just did it with a sense of urgency. Wells understood the technology of going from theater to radio, and understood that radio was live and that news was going to be read in a certain way, that there was an inflection that was different between the news and the entertainment pieces. So, you know, the Blair Witch Project ignored every popular trend at that moment. It did not have WB people on there. It didn't have a lot of music that was contemporary. It didn't have shiny, beautiful photography. You know, all those trends were gone. The audience expectations were completely shattered, and it became a phenomenon. And it helped make the found footage subgenre this kind of legacy. Movies behind the third door of death are like a language waiting to be discovered, right? They're like the lingua franca for a new generation. But for the older generation, it's just fucking gibberish, right? The younger audience finds a story from their own lived experiences. They have an antidote to the old classics that keep getting shoved down their throats. The third door is anarchic, right? It's an anarchic break from tradition, from wisdom sometimes. These movies are not always wisely made. Sometimes it goes against the philosophy of how we make movies. It goes against what we consider our morality. These movies, they see the world through a lens that, quite honestly, many times the older generation is going to be blind to. So I mentioned Bonnie and Clyde earlier. I think I mentioned it a couple times. So we're going to come back to Bonnie and Clyde to make an example before I move on to the thing that's going to get me all the hate mail. So the example about Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, directed by Arthur Penn. Now, the true story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow was mythical, right? Everybody, in America knew Bonnie and Clyde. It was also a cautionary tale. Things don't go well when you go against John Law. People used to buy tickets. In fact, I was at state fairs where they would have the car the couple was gunned down in. And it's at 130 bullet holes, and you could pay $1 to go count every one of the 130 bullet holes. You're looking at the car that these two people were killed in, gunned down by all these people. So there's this weird kind of, I don't call it hero worship, but there is this whole thing of like there's a luridness to the Bonnie and Clyde idea. The very idea that you go count bullet holes in a car tells me something's a little bit strange. So Penn's movie, Arthur Penn's film, two outlaws become folk heroes. And Warren Beatty is playing Clyde Barrow. And in this film, it shows the establishment is what's crooked. And it doesn't care about the common Americans struggling in the Great Depression. They care about the banks. That's what the government is. So the Barrow gang and the bloody crime spree that they're going on, it's kind of shown as a justifiable liberation. And it's kind of shot like an irreverent kind of road movie, on the road to Morocco or something like that, with comedic elements until somebody gets shot in the face, until someone gets gunned down, until 130 bullets go through two people. Old-fashioned establishment film critics did not get this movie. So the New York Times had Bosley Crowther, and he was the velvet rope guy. He was the guardian of taste coming out of the New York Times. And he lost his fucking mind on this movie. So I have his review here. This blending of farce with brutal killings is as pointless as it is lacking in taste, since it makes no valid commentary upon the already travestied truth. So Arthur Penn essentially took a very recognizable symbol, turned its meaning on its ear, and he did that to make a commentary that the older generation of Bosley Crowther didn't get. But boomers that were dealing with maybe going to Vietnam completely understood. So he didn't get it, Bosley Crowther, because he was part of the problem. I bring all of that stuff up. I bring up how generations sometimes just get outraged when there's this change that happens. So, Blair Witch Project used technology, right? Growing technology, the internet, incorporated that raw look of ghost hunter videos and ended up creating this whole big phenomenon, started found footage revolution. So Skinamarink embraces both how technology and the anxiety of life-altering current events can radically change how we tell stories. I think it's easily one of the most divisive and controversial horror films of the 21st century. Audience members were so polarized in their opinions of this movie. I mean, many actually, found it a very terrifying experience, tapped into their own personal nightmares. Just as many openly hated it and even debated whether it qualifies as a legitimate film. Many people thought it's merely a stunt. It's a cynical marketing ploy. Whichever opinion wins out, I guess that's for history to decide. It's gonna play through as it does. I've watched it a couple times now. I have to say, the first time I had to watch it in compartments and pieces, and Skinamarink actually kind of opened my eyes. My response to Skinamarink opened my eyes to the gulf between generations of viewers. because I went on Facebook after watching it and I said, well, Skinamarink was kind of strange. I guess I can't wait until the sequel, Rink-a-Dink-a-Doo. And, making fun, being funny, being silly. And I started getting instant messages from fans, people who listen to this show. And they were like, I thought you were like the Vanguard guy. I thought you were like No Velvet Ropes. And you're just shitting on this thing. And this thing's terrifying. And what's wrong with you? And I was like, wow. They called me on my shit. That a lot of times I sit there and I say, the problem is you're not allowing yourself to be open to the experience. You don't have to like it, but you have to respect it. And I wasn't respecting it. I was going down the thing of the people who would look at Guernica, Picasso's Guernica, and go, I could draw that. That was essentially how I was reacting. So I didn't want to be in that way anymore. One thing is for sure about Skinamarink. It struck a nerve. And it wasn't a singular movie, an aberration, a weird thing like people just didn't know what they were doing. It wasn't an embarrassing fluke. It was a micro-budgeted film that caught on to the liminal horror subgenre. It paved the way for other films that challenge the traditional narrative structure in general. The idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end. As hard as it may seem to believe, that is actually a new narrative style that is succeeding, that has to do with liminal space, liminal horror. Now, saying that Skinamarink challenged traditional narrative structure might be an understatement. I mean, it refused to play by the simplest of expected storytelling rules, the idea of having that defined beginning, middle, or end. Movie doesn't begin as much as it kind of wakes up disoriented from like a long nap. It's the first thing that you see is a grainy, low light image. And it's like as if shot from an old 1980s camcorder. We're in a dark hallway. We're at carpet level with the only available light coming from cracked open bedroom doors. The only sound is this hollow audio that you can tell is from unseen rooms somewhere deep in the house. And the audio is coming from public domain cartoons that they could play on a loop. It's on a VHS loop on television. Very reminiscent of growing up with the TV for me and for the generation after me. Kids growing up where their parents aren't watching them. They're just watching the same VHS tapes over and over again. Bulk of the movie unfolds at literal eye-level perspective of the two preschool-age children. I think they're 4 and 6. And the story is that they wake up and slowly realize their parents are missing. And their homes, the windows in the house, the front door, the toilet at one point disappear. They're just out of the house. There's just a blank space where they were. There's more wall where there used to be a window. And they're left alone. They're unable to escape the house. They're hearing voices. They're asking to come upstairs. They think it's their parents' voice. They go up there and mom's just sitting on the bed and then mom's gone. And there's these long shots of this. Is it mom? Is it something up there that's disguised as mom, disguised as dad? Why would mom tell the kid to stick a razor blade in its eye? And the movie goes through all this shit in these really long shots. And then it just ends. The movie doesn't end as much as it just kind of falls back to sleep in a way. The final image lasts over a minute. And it's a dark room. There's a barely perceptible face within that room. And it's telling us to go to sleep. And what's interesting is that face in the last scene, it's kind of like a Rorschach test. People who were scared, that were completely connected and engrossed in that film, saw the face. Those who were watching the movie and couldn't wait for it to fucking end, they saw no face. They were just, I think they were looking at their watches. So the thing is, that movie goes on for 100 minutes. So for 100-minute running time, Skinamarink comprises just completely of very long static shots, minimal dialogue, super little plot development, total disregard for traditional audience expectations all the way around. I mean, some of the creative choices are fucking perverse. They're just downright perverse. Not only is the entire film shot from the vantage point of toddlers, which means most of the movie is about a foot or two off the floor, but most of the time we only see the children from behind. We never in the entire movie see a full human face, and that would help us connect emotionally to the characters. But we can't really see them. We're constantly in this state of anxiety. Will this shot ever end? Will this sound ever end? Will we ever see these kids' faces? And Skinamarink is trying to disconnect from every narrative device you can think of, including time. It's a movie that was made in 2022. It feels like it's trying to look like it was filmed in 1972, and in many ways it does feel that way. But the title card says it takes place in 1995 for no reason that I can think of. It just is. So there's no windows, there's no doors, so all the light is artificial. It's all the glow of a TV screen, all the lights that are there, the night lights that are stuck in the outlets. So if all the lights are artificial, we see no daylight, we have no idea how much story time passes, right? Are these children alone for hours? Are they alone for days? Is it years? We and the children are in a cinematic limbo. And that lack of certainty, the lack of any continuity, story resolution, there is none. All of that stokes some very vocal hatred for the movie. And yet many horror fans, with all of that I've just told you, found it viscerally terrifying and groundbreaking. And Skinamarink affected them far more than most traditional horror films did. You know, when people get interviewed about this, people who are fans, if you go on websites, go on Reddit and see what people are saying about Skinamarink, when you find this group, they're like, this works so much better than traditional horror films. This envelops me in a way. So there are other liminal horror films. So Skinamarink may have popularized it. I won't say it's the first liminal horror film, but it popularized it. And then you had movies like The Outwaters, a movie called Come True, Ennie's Men, We're All Going to the World's Fair, and In a Violent Nature. These movies dedicate themselves to, they're really about an emotional feeling. It's all about what you feel. It's not about what you think about. It's not about comforting you in that way. There's no comfort in these movies. So they're dedicating themselves to this emotional feeling. Really, I think the feeling is this just nightmarish sense of dread. They pick dread, this energy, this feeling, over, say, narrative structure, any kind of horror movie tropes. Although, believe it or not, there are like 2 really effective jump scares in there. It took me viewing 2 to find them. The first time, it was amazing how disconnected I was from this movie. I just couldn't get it. Couldn't penetrate it. I had to take it in quarters. I think I would watch for 20 minutes and I had to get up and walk around. You know, stuff like that was happening. Then the second time, I wore really good headphones. I turned off the lights, and it is amazing the difference in how that movie worked. Anyway, these movies just don't care about the narrative structure. They don't care about the tropes that are usually there. Liminal horror movies they're ghost stories, they're haunted houses, they're demonic possessions. They can even be slashers, right? But they just jettison everything except for the bare bones of the framework. So, yeah, I'm using this term liminal horror. I may have used it on the show before. I know I've said it in interviews. I've been asked about this often. What the hell is liminal horror? So let me give a quick definition, hopefully quick, because I know this show has gone long. Liminal horror, really, it's existed in various incarnations for a long time. It's been in the margins of storytelling. So liminal refers to a state of transition, right? The spot between going from here to there. So liminal spaces are usually something tangible, like airport terminals, long hotel hallways that have a lot of corners. But they can also be, tangible, but they can also be abstract. So a liminal film can be about something like a state of grief. It can be about depression. It can be, watching a prolonged illness. The horror that is generated is when we find ourselves trapped in that transitional space. See, you're only supposed to spend a certain amount of time in an airport terminal or a hotel hallway. You're only supposed to be sad or depressed or ill for a transitional time period, a short period of time. When we're trapped in that transitional space and we can't find our way out, there's no exit whatsoever. That's where the horror comes in. So liminal horror is like the terror of limbo. It's kind of challenging to provide a definitive explanation or for anything that is like a trend, right? Why do cultural and artistic trends happen? Who knows? But I think there are things that you can look at, that there can be moments in time, elements that can happen, experiences, events, tragedies that can happen on a large scale that can change the course of what is expected in films. I mentioned it before, how 28 Days Later was able to use that look, the camera video, home video being shot about 9/11. But I think first and foremost, whether anything major had happened around the time that Skinamarink was being made, there's something pretty universal about it as well. Because even though it's experimental in how it's executed and it has those low-tech visuals, there's a very minimal sound design, it's got a very primal fear from early childhood at its heart. Did you ever wake up in the middle of the night as a kid and have the house that you're in, the silence of the house scare you, the darkness of the house scare you? It's quiet. Everybody's asleep. It's your house. The only thing that's changed is that the lights are off. But because it's so quiet, it gets scary. Somehow the dead of night, just the dead of night when you're a kid, turns your home into an uncanny valley. One of the most frightening things that ever happened in my life when I was a kid was I woke up in the middle of the night and I needed to pee, but I was too scared to get out of bed. And I called out for my dad. Dad, silence, right? I mean, he's dead asleep. It's 3:00 in the damn morning. And I go, Dad? And I expect him to run in like a manservant. So there's dead silence. And what does my kid's mind think? Dead. They're dead. Something's in the other room. It's killed them. And so my answer is to start screaming, Dad, Dad, Dad. And poor Dad has to come in staggering. What? And trying to explain something that he universally already understands. But I'm like, how is he ever going to understand that I was scared by the very house I was in because it felt wrong and too quiet and too dark? Of course he knew. So writer-director Kyle Edward Ball found out how common that fear was. He had a YouTube channel called Bite-Sized Nightmares, and he kind of had a reasonably big following, I guess, where he would get people who were subscribers, and he'd make short movies that were kind of recreating their nightmares. And as he was doing this, he had this idea. He thought it'd be like an unlimited supply of stuff. He started to realize how many people had the same kind of nightmare setup, that when they were doing these requests, they were like, I'm a kid. I wake up. I can't find my parents. I can't find my way out of the house, and something's there. So it's the maze and the Minotaur, right? And he realized that that was so common that he decided to make Skinamarink from that framework. So technology like YouTube videos and video games, they play a big part in the cinematic language of Skinamarink. And I think why the movie struck a chord with predominantly younger audiences. As of 2020, the gaming industry makes more money than the music and movie industries combined. There have been several generations now where video games are the primary storytelling language. And the storytelling language does not necessarily work on the beginning, middle, and end format. There are several different types of games that are played. So you have video games and movies that take cues from each other. But if we're looking at video games, survival horror games still are big. Silent Hill, they really took a lot of cues from movies. Silent Hill tried to be as cinematic as possible, and of course then it was made into a movie. So their visual gameplay is very much looking like cinema. but they also have a very free narrative style. It doesn't have the traditional motion picture style. It doesn't have the kind of narrative structure. Video games can be nonlinear in structure. They can have a sandbox open world structure where the player can enter the story anywhere they want to, and there's branching narratives that can change the story by the choices that the player makes. I mean, these dynamics mean that games aren't married to a 3-act narrative like most movies are. They're not married to a 90 to 120 minute story arc that most films are. When we hear that the new generation is bored with movies, we immediately want to go to the fact that they have a short attention span. I think they just have a short attention span for something that they've seen a million times, something that they don't really relate to. They just don't care. But when it comes down to something that they're interested in, they can play a video game for 3 weeks straight. They can watch 10-episode miniseries on Netflix of Haunting of Hill House. No problem with focus there. No problem with long durations. But there's something about the 3-act narrative in that 90 to 120 minute story arc that can be limiting. It's not that it's dead. It's that it is limiting. So playable teaser for Silent Hill was called PT, which is playable teaser. It came out in 2014, and it featured a breakaway from even the things that Silent Hill and stuff had. You're just an unknown person. You're the single player. You're in this first-person perspective. You wake up in a room on the floor inside a haunted house, and you walk into a hallway. And when you're in that hallway, it's a conditional loop. It keeps going around and around. You're in the same place again and again, but it redecorates and it changes every time you turn the corner. So you start having more clues show up, weird things like some weird, crazy, disgusting fetus kind of things in the sink. And anyway, it gets weirder and weirder and weirder, but story really is secondary to what they're really going for on this. It's an emotional experience. So when you're playing PT, you're getting creeped out by the repetition and the fact that you just can't seem to figure your way out. So video games by their nature, right, loosen the rules around structure. They allow for a much more experimental kind of language to be used. They make experimental cinematic language more commonplace. If you're doing nothing, like I mentioned in the very beginning of this podcast, the idea that you can like a comedian, and if you like them so much, you start to know exactly where the rim shots are and where the punchline is going to come in. The same thing happens with movies. Same thing happens with video games. So when you can go into that more experimental language, you make the language more accessible. So you add to that the low-tech look that YouTube and TikTok has normalized. There is no style in YouTube, and people are watching these for hours and hours and hours, and it normalizes that kind of look. So something that normally would not be permissible in cinema now suddenly is, because of the repetition of things that we see all the time. The more commonplace entertainments, going out to theater, to cinemas, is further down the line. It's no longer the number one thing to do for entertainment. So you have this idea with that normalization of the grittiness and looseness of the look of YouTube and TikTok. Grainy and shaky footage, in low light and stuff, can feel more authentic than professionally shot and polished looking things. It just kind of feels more authentic because there's less pretense, and Skimmering definitely benefits from that kind of mindset. And I think outside of the technical that I'm talking about, there's a very cultural and societal reason that I think Skinamarink made the impact that it did. Directly or indirectly, it capitalized on the anxiety that we were all living through with the COVID pandemic. Locked down in our homes, for months on end, people trapped inside with each other. There were people who were divorcing that ended up having to live with each other. People who broke up, who had to find a way to coexist because they couldn't leave the house. People were stuck with their abusers, right? All that kind of crazy shit was happening. Fictional limbo of liminal horror suddenly was mirroring the real world limbo that we were experiencing. I remember walking through San Francisco in the dead of night because there's nobody out. Walking in the middle of Columbus Street, which is a very big street. It goes through North Beach. And I'm going in one spot where 5 major streets all converge. And I walk and I can turn. I'm in the middle of the street and there's not one car in any of the streets that's moving. And all the houses are dark. And I'm like, these are all like coffins. I know there are people behind there. And I'm like this ghost out there. So it was really, really creepy. So with that, we ended up being trapped and in our houses. And we had this whole thing where our lives became claustrophobic. Everything was like a little traumatizing. Trapped in the houses, unable to escape some invisible monster that was killing people. Is it in the house? Is it in our skin? Is it in the air? We don't know. Some kind of weird, invisible fucking thing. So maybe the reason that fans of Skinamarink, the younger generation, is so connected to this movie is because it not only taps into a very common visceral childhood fear, but it's also commenting on a very real sense of limbo from the pandemic, told in a style that expresses that existential uncertainty that we had, happening at an age which is an impressionable, only maybe 16 to 18 years, maybe younger, and all of a sudden the world comes to a stop and people are dying from something you can't see. Yeah, perhaps that started some kind of existential uncertainty for people who had no other context in life, even remotely close to that. And maybe older fans hated Skinamarink because limbo does not offer a resolution. By nature, limbo does not offer resolutions. And resolution is a key part to traditional story structure. So what do you do when stories don't offer a resolution anymore? Well, I don't know. I guess you kind of have to bask in it. And I don't know what the future is going to hold. But I will say that by ignoring expectations completely, movies like Skinamarink, the genre in a direction that nobody even thought was a direction to go in. And to me, that's kind of exciting. And to me, that's a place where I can find some surprise. I may not be a fan of all this kind of stuff, right? I may not be wearing Skinamarink t-shirts anytime soon. But I sure as hell can respect that this is part of the evolutionary process that horror goes through. Will it continue in that direction? Well, that's anybody's guess. Will something else come out of it? Sprouting from maybe this thing that got so far and then died out, but the seeds found their way into a more fertile ground and something else grows in that place. Perhaps that's what's going to happen. The thing is, whatever it's going to end up becoming, it's going to be something that will be only interesting to us if it remembers to surprise us. So once again, the 3 doors of death: meeting expectations, subverting expectations, and ignoring expectations. These are the things that I believe are going to make horror fans happy. If you remember to surprise us, even though we've seen it all, we're going to have a good time. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening for as long as you have. It's been a pleasure being able to spew this craziness out to you. I'm sure someone's going to have some comments or opinions about my opinions. I welcome them. I embrace them like a madman coming at me with an axe. Anyway, I hope that everybody has a magnificent Halloween. And until next time, thank you so much for listening, and stay Hellbent. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and my Twitter handle is Hellbent Horror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.